June 22, 1941. Sunday morning, 4:15 a.m. The air above the western Soviet frontier was calm. The sun had barely touched the horizon. Birds were singing across the fields near Brest, Minsk, and Lviv. And then the horizon itself erupted. More than 3,000 German aircraft crossed the border without warning. Bombs rained down on airfields, bridges, and sleeping barracks. By sunrise, entire Soviet regiments had been obliterated. This was Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's long-prepared invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military operation in human history. Over 3 million Axis soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and 7,000 guns stormed across an 1,800-mile front. Within hours, chaos consumed the western USSR. At 7 a.m., the Soviet radio began broadcasting frantic bulletins. "Attention! Attention! German forces have attacked our border. We are at war." In the cities, panic spread faster than the fire from falling bombs. Trains overloaded with refugees choked the railways eastward. Women clutched their children as columns of soldiers disappeared toward the front. For millions, the nightmare had begun. The collapse. In the first 10 days, the Soviet Air Force lost over 4,000 aircraft, most destroyed on the ground before they could take off. German panzers advanced 30 miles a day, slicing through Soviet defenses. Entire armies were surrounded near Minsk and Smolensk. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured. By July, the Wehrmacht had penetrated 300 miles into Soviet territory. Leningrad was under siege, Kiev was encircled, and the road to Moscow lay open. Inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin sat in shock. The man who had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler just 2 years ago had been caught completely unprepared. For nearly 48 hours after the invasion began, Stalin said almost nothing. He refused to believe the reports of disaster. On July 3rd, he finally addressed the nation on radio. "Brothers and sisters, our cause is just. The enemy will be crushed. Victory will be ours." But few believed it. The German army seemed unstoppable. The strain on the home front. Factories in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia were evacuated eastward under desperate conditions. Entire assembly lines were dismantled and shipped by rail to the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. Trains carried lathes, presses, and blueprints alongside families and livestock. For the ordinary Soviet mother, the war arrived as hunger, fear, and silence. Letters from the front stopped coming. Cities ran out of food and coal. Winter was coming, and the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. The Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse until an unexpected decision on the other side of the world began to change everything. Washington, D.C., June 24, 1941. 2 days after the invasion, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed his nation. "Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid." Roosevelt listened carefully in the Oval Office. America was still officially neutral, but Roosevelt saw what was coming. If the Soviet Union fell, Germany would control Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, and the next step would be the British Isles, perhaps even the United States. So Roosevelt made a decision that stunned his cabinet. America would extend the Lend-Lease Act, a program already supplying Britain, to include the Soviet Union. Under this act, America would not sell weapons. It would lend or lease them to any nation whose defense was vital to the defense of the United States. Payment would come later, if ever. On October 1, 1941, representatives of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union signed the first protocol of Lend-Lease in Moscow. It promised 400 aircraft per month, 500 tanks, 10,000 trucks, plus thousands of tons of raw materials, explosives, and food. The first lifeline. By August 1941, convoys began leaving American ports for the northern Soviet harbors of Murmansk and Archangel. The voyage was treacherous. Arctic storms, icebergs, and German submarines lurked everywhere. But every successful shipment meant new hope. Each convoy consisted of up to 40 merchant ships escorted by Royal Navy and U.S. destroyers. The sailors called these voyages the Murmansk Run, a 2,000-mile gauntlet of death. Torpedo wakes sliced the dark waters. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into fog and snow. By the end of 1941, over 500,000 tons of American supplies had reached Soviet soil. It was not enough to win the war, but it prevented total collapse. The cargoes included strange new machines stamped with foreign letters: B-25 Mitchell Bomber, A-20 Havoc, P-39 Airacobra. Soviet technicians unpacked them cautiously, amazed at the precision engineering. These planes, one Red Air Force mechanic wrote, seemed built from another world. They had radios that worked in the snow, heaters for pilots, and engines that did not die after one flight. The challenge of distance. Yet shipping aircraft by sea was painfully slow and costly. Each bomber had to be dismantled, crated, loaded onto ships, sent through U-boat-infested waters, and then reassembled in Soviet factories. Loss rates on the Murmansk convoys sometimes reached 20%. The Soviets proposed an alternative: fly the planes over the North Pacific. At first, U.S. generals dismissed the idea as insane. The route would cross thousands of miles of wilderness, from Montana to Alaska to Siberia, through some of the harshest weather on Earth. But necessity forced boldness. By November 1941, engineers were mapping the Alaska-Siberia air route, later known by its code name ALSIB. December 1941, the world at war. Then came another explosion, this time in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was now at war. Roosevelt's voice thundered across the radio. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The conflict had become truly global. Now, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States were official allies, bound together by survival. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill began exchanging cables directly. In one such message, Stalin wrote, "The aid you have promised is the most essential factor in our struggle against the common enemy. Every day counts." Roosevelt replied, "We are with you to the end." And so, as 1941 turned to 1942, thousands of American workers, men and women, in Detroit, Seattle, Buffalo, and San Diego labored day and night. They built bombers, tanks, and trucks, not for themselves, but for a distant front they would never see. The Air Bridge of Friendship, 1942 to 1943. The birth of ALSIB. January 1942. The snows over Alaska were deeper than memory. At -40 degrees, even steel screamed when touched. Yet in Fairbanks, a new kind of outpost was being carved out of the wilderness. Runways were bulldozed from ice and gravel. Wooden barracks rose beside stacks of fuel drums painted with white stars. American officers called it Ladd Field. This frozen frontier would soon become the first link in a 6,000-mile aerial chain joining two worlds. The route would run Great Falls, Montana, Edmonton, Alberta, Whitehorse, Yukon, Fairbanks, Alaska, Nome, Siberia, Yakutsk, Krasnoyarsk, Moscow. It would carry warplanes built in the factories of Kansas and California directly into the hands of Soviet pilots fighting at Stalingrad. The project was codenamed ALSIB, short for Alaska, Siberia. It was an audacious plan born of desperation. In Washington, the War Department doubted it could ever work. Arctic storms, magnetic anomalies, and the sheer emptiness of Siberia made navigation nearly impossible. Yet Roosevelt ordered it done. General Henry Hap Arnold of the U.S. Air Forces said simply, "If the Soviets can fly in snow, we can build in it." By spring, teams of American engineers, Canadian bush pilots, and Russian specialists had converged on Alaska. Lumber from Oregon arrived by rail. Bulldozers followed. Radio towers blinked into life across the tundra. The first crossing. September 3, 1942. The first formation of 5 A-20 Havoc bombers lifted off from Ladd Field. Each aircraft bore fresh red stars painted beside the white U.S. serial numbers, a symbol of the alliance that had once been unthinkable. At the controls were Soviet ferry pilots, many barely 20 years old. They wore American fur-lined flight suits and carried maps marked in both English and Cyrillic. American mechanics waved as the planes disappeared into the northern sky. Hours later, the bombers touched down in Nome, the last American airfield before the Bering Strait. On the opposite shore lay the Soviet base at Uelkal, only 56 miles away, yet separated by blizzards, fog, and sea ice. Crossing that narrow gap meant leaving one world for another. A small ceremony took place as the first Soviet-flown bomber landed on Siberian soil. A U.S. officer radioed Fairbanks, "Mission complete. The bridge is open." Between 1942 and 1945, more than 8,000 aircraft would make that journey. The lifeline in motion. The logistics were staggering. Every bomber required fuel, maintenance, and spare parts delivered by convoy or rail across the Alcan Highway. American women Air Force service pilots, WASPs, sometimes ferried smaller planes to staging posts. Native Alaskan workers maintained the icy runways. On the Soviet side, thousands of mechanics and ground crews braved temperatures plunging to minus 50 degrees Celsius. They lived in tents heated by oil drums, slept in shifts, and melted snow for drinking water. Yet morale was high. Each aircraft arriving from America meant new hope. By late 1942, the ALSIB corridor was moving at full pace. B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, P-39 Airacobra fighters, C-47 Dakota transports, and A-20 Havocs thundered across the Arctic sky. Every fifth plane crashed or was forced down en route, yet pilots kept flying. A Soviet ferry pilot later recalled, "We navigated by rivers and the color of the clouds. When the compass froze, we followed the smoke of our own engines." Stalingrad, the turning point. While the aerial bridge grew, the ground war reached its most brutal climax. August 23, 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad began. German bombers reduced the city to rubble. Entire neighborhoods burned for days. But by October, Soviet pilots flying American-supplied A-20 Havocs were conducting nightly raids against German positions along the Volga. According to wartime records, 863 sorties were flown by Lend-Lease aircraft during the winter of 1942-43 in the Stalingrad sector alone. Their reliability astonished Soviet commanders. Unlike older Soviet designs, the American planes could operate in bitter cold without engine failure. A report from the 221st Bomber Regiment noted, "Our A-20 start at -35°C. They carry heavier loads and return home on one engine. Crews trust them as they trust their own hearts." When the Red Army finally encircled and destroyed the German Sixth Army in February 1943, hundreds of these missions had helped cut off supply lines and troop movements. After the victory, one Soviet general remarked privately, "The American machine did its duty. Our soldiers know it." Mothers on the home front. Far from the front, in villages across the Soviet Union, word spread that new aircraft from the Amerikansky Drugi, the American friends, were saving sons at the front. Mothers who had received telegrams saying, "missing," began to hear that their sons had returned from missions in planes with strange English dials and soft leather seats. Factories in the Urals hung small signs, "For the American people, Spasibo." Although Stalin's propaganda machine forbade open gratitude, many families knew the truth. Women sewed small American flags from scraps of fabric and kept them hidden in trunks. In diaries later discovered, some wrote lines like, "They say these planes come from far across the sea. If they help bring my boy home, then may God bless the people who built them." By the end of 1943, the ALI-SIB route had delivered 3,000 aircraft. It was now the safest and most efficient link of the Lend-Lease network. American and Soviet airmen shared toasts of frozen vodka in log cabins near Yakutsk, repeating one phrase that crossed every language barrier, "Zapobiedo," to victory. The sky that ended the war, 1944 to 1945. The alliance at its peak. January 1944. The Soviet Union was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for victory. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, German forces were retreating. In Moscow, Red Square was draped with banners reading, "To Berlin." But behind that confidence stood a massive invisible supply chain that stretched halfway around the globe. By early 1944, the United States had delivered to the USSR through Lend-Lease 11,400 aircraft, including more than 800 B-25 Mitchell bombers, 7,000 tanks, 375,000 trucks, 2 million tons of fuel, and enough food to feed the Red Army for months. It was the most extensive logistical operation in history. Every American-built plane that crossed the Al-Sib route carried a small placard inside the cockpit. "Property of the United States government, operated by the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreement." In practice, those aircraft became Soviet forever. Few were ever returned. The bombers of the Eastern Front. The B-25 Mitchell, originally designed as a medium-range American bomber, became one of the Soviet Air Force's favorite weapons. Its twin engines, durable frame, and high payload made it ideal for the low-altitude, high-risk missions of the Eastern Front. From 1943 through 1945, Soviet B-25 squadrons struck rail lines, depots, and bridges across occupied Poland and Ukraine. They flew in formations of 6 to 10 aircraft, escorted by P-39 Airacobra fighters, also American-made. In one report from the 4th Guards Bomber Regiment, dated May 1944, the commander wrote, "We call them our flying fortresses. When our boys climb into the Mitchells, they trust that no fire will bring them down easily." Pilots praised the B-25's Norden bomb sight and internal heating, luxuries unheard of in Soviet aircraft. And unlike many Soviet models, it carried armor plating to protect crews from flak. When used to bomb German supply columns near the Dieper Ritter, the effect was devastating. Local villagers later recalled seeing the sky filled with the distinctive twin tails of the American bombers. The road to Berlin. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As American and British forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that crushed the German Army Group Center in Belarus. It was one of the largest military victories in history, and it relied heavily on American logistics. Soviet columns moved faster than ever before. Why? Because the Red Army now had hundreds of thousands of Studebaker and GMC trucks supplied through Lend-Lease. These trucks towed artillery, carried fuel, and ferried troops at speeds unthinkable in 1941. Marshal Georgy Zhukov later admitted, "Without the vehicles we received through Lend-Lease, our advance would have stalled. The American trucks are as important as our tanks." In the skies above, Soviet pilots in B-25s and A-20s pounded retreating German convoys day and night. One of them, Captain Vasily Arkhipov, wrote in his diary, "The Mitchell is a friend. She takes hits, she keeps flying. My mother will not cry tonight." The Winter of Fire. The winter of 1944-1945 was brutal but final. The Red Army crossed into Poland, then into Germany itself. In February 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from both sides, a joint mission was secretly planned between American and Soviet high commands. The delivery of one last wave of Lend-Lease supplies by air, including spare engines, bomb sights, and medical kits. Dozens of flights crossed the Alsib corridor under polar night. Some never arrived. Those who did landed to cheers. The war's end was finally near. Victory and farewell. May 15, 1945, Victory Day. The war in Europe was over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Red Army stood triumphant amid the ruins. In Moscow, celebrations erupted across the city. Stalin stood on the Kremlin balcony as fireworks illuminated the night sky. Beneath the roar, a small group of pilots from the ALSIB route toasted their fallen comrades. They raised their glasses and said, "To those who built the bridge in the sky." In Alaska, American officers gathered for a quieter ceremony at Ladd Field. The last Soviet convoy of aircraft had departed weeks earlier. 8,000 in total had crossed the route. More than 130 American and Soviet airmen had died along the way. Colonel William L. Holohan, who supervised the ALSIB operations, later said, "It was the strangest alliance in history, and perhaps the most necessary. We did our duty, they did theirs, and the world was saved from darkness." After the guns fell silent. After the war, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to fracture almost immediately. By 1947, the Cold War had begun. Lend-Lease was quietly ended, diplomatic cables turned cold. Yet in small towns across Siberia and Russia's Far East, relics of that cooperation remained. B-25s sat rusting in snow-covered airfields. Children played inside the empty cockpits, unaware that their fathers had once flown those machines against the might of Nazi Germany. In the years that followed, Western historians rarely mentioned the ALSIB route. It had been overshadowed by the politics of the Cold War. But the memories survived in the hearts of those who lived through it. The Mother's Gratitude. In the 1980s, Soviet journalists began collecting oral histories from the war's survivors. Many of those interviews contained a recurring phrase, "We thanked the American bombers." When asked why, one elderly woman from Novosibirsk explained, Because my son flew one. It brought him home. They said it came from America, so I thanked the people who built it." Another from Yakutsk said quietly, "I never met an American, but I saw their planes. They saved my village when the Germans came close. That is enough." Those words became symbolic, not of politics, but of shared humanity. In 2006, at Fairbanks, Alaska, a monument was unveiled. The Alaska-Siberia Air Bridge Memorial. Bronze figures of American and Soviet airmen stand side by side, shaking hands. At the dedication, a Russian ambassador said, "These men flew through ice and death so that our mothers could sleep in peace. History will remember them, even when nations forget." The legacy. Today, historians recognize that the Lend-Lease program shortened World War II by at least a year. Without it, the Soviet Union might have collapsed under Germany's assault. The ALSIB route remains one of the greatest feats of logistics and cooperation ever achieved. It wasn't just machines that crossed that frozen sky. It was trust, courage, and the will to survive. And so when people say Russian mothers thanked American bombers, they speak a truth that goes beyond literal words. It is the gratitude of families who lived because strangers, half a world away, believed in a common cause. As one veteran said at the end of his life, "We fought with different flags, but under the same sky."